10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good golly, Miss Molly. Welcome to It's Only Talk and Roll, the show where we attempt to celebrate the music we love, keep alive the classic rock of the past. But today we are going to go all electro, as we talk about the German man machines themselves, Kraftwerk. You have to say it that way for the rest of the show. Kraftwerk, pioneers of electronic music, electro-pop, house and techno, dance music, industrial, prog, and a zillion other genres. Who were they? How did they do what they did? What was their lasting influence? We're going to take a look at not only that, but some of the gear they used back in the day, and which other acts from that era were trying to do some of the same things with that gear, perhaps more mainstream rock acts, and also their influence on later music. Many people actually believe that they are as influential in their own way as the Beatles, and certainly an argument can be made for that, as it's an entire huge roadway, an autobahn, if you like, of music that was inspired by them. So we're definitely going to touch on that. We're never going to cover the entirety of the electronic music world and its history, because there's just too much to do in one sitting. So we'll just touch on a few acts, those who were also pioneers, those who were inspired by Kraftwerk. The panel may have a couple of their own suggestions, and I'm sure the chat will too. So welcome anyway. Thank you for being here. It's probably going to be a small bunch today, as this is possibly a slightly more eclectic topic, but I don't know. What do I know? People love Kraftwerk, people love electronic music, and we've already got. It's great to see both here on YouTube, over in Rumble, and on Twitter. There's people already hanging about. So welcome to you all. It's great to see you, my friends that make this show everything it is. We have the great hoser in chief himself, Lord Thoth. We have with us Davina, listening to Dementia Machine right now, possibly one of my favorite albums, certainly my favorite Kraftwerk album. Who else do we have in the house? Das Haus with us today. We have Tim. How are you, buddy? The Snorty is here. Hello to you, Snorty. Davina, of course, we've mentioned. Beep boop is very appropriate today. Boing, clang, 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 cling, clang. Very appropriate sounds. The great Christian Delorme is here. Good to see you, my friend. Lord Thoth, we mentioned. The great Wrench of Wrenches, my high sticker channel member, D. Bud Martin. He is in das Haus. And I'm sure he'll be doing some of that German dancing for us later. And anyone else I've missed, forgive me. DJ Play Nice is here. Rock, exactly. Is it rock? This is the question. I think it's all part of that great tapestry that is rock music. Sean Estep is here. Good to see you, buddy. And that we'll get into a bit more. But even if it's not considered rock, or maybe it's prog, or maybe it's something else, it's still a wonderful, marvelous piece of music. I've always had a soft spot for Kraftwerk. I have actually seen them twice in concert, which for a band that was quite reclusive for many years is not necessarily something a lot of people could say. Maybe now, because they tour more now. Here's the ticket from the first time I saw them on the Computer World tour at the Odeon Theatre in Birmingham. A massive £4 to see them on that tour. That was a very exciting night. Then I saw them again at the Brixton Academy on the 20th of March 2004 on the tour which became the Minimum Maximum live album. Very, very, very nice night at the Brixton Academy. So that was very enjoyable. In fact, there's the poster from it. They actually did have arms, so they weren't completely armless, just mostly armless. It sounds like almost like that could be a Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy joke. So I'll head back to the beginning there, hide that for the moment. So I must welcome, obviously appropriately for Sean Electronic Music, I have two of the biggest metal fans on the planet joining me. First of all, Imperatus, my friend. How are you?
I'm doing all right.
Have you got your mini Moog ready?
All that. I mean, I will say though that some of the stuff these guys did had some influence into what I listen to nowadays. Simply with just bringing in synth and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I'm interested to explore that. There are a couple of metal acts that are and industrial acts that possibly cross into metal that we're definitely going to talk about later. In fact, the more Germanic they are, the closer the match.
Yeah, that tends to happen.
So definitely looking for your insight in that. And it's, for me, it wasn't just that the fact that that they had a particular sound, Kraftwerk, much of which they created themselves from scratch, created a lot of their instrumentation, did things that other bands, even bands that were heavily into keyboard stuff, didn't do. But it was more often their style and their approach, minimalist, repetitive rhythms, electronic drum sounds. A lot of that influenced not only dance stuff, but also some metal and industrial bands. And their influence in terms of themes of modernism, engineering, communications, computing, and what I would call retrofuturism, that Metropolis look, particularly to the Man Machine album. Somebody once said about them that they had a nostalgia for the future, which I really like that phrase because it kind of the future they were showing was a retro view of that future, which I really like for a long time. So that has translated into a number of acts that have copied that look, never mind the sound. And the studio manipulation that they did of sound became something that was many other acts exploited or learned from. So there's a lot there a lot more to them than just four guys not moving a lot, pressing buttons. So DJ Play Nice, been listening to electronica since the 1970s. Dad did an internship with Bob, and I'm going to say Moog, in 1969, also the year I was born. That is really interesting. DJ Play Nice. there has been much of a debate over the decades whether his name was Moog or Moog. I believe the gentleman, Bob Moog, said Moog, but correct me if I'm wrong. But just everyone kind of says Moog. I do it all the time. Mini Moog, Moog. Moog, I think, was actually how it's pronounced. And we'll touch we will be touching a little bit on the Britpop stuff too. Huge inspiration on that late 70s, early 80s burst of British electro-pop bands and acts. So a little bit. Moog, say the English, say it right. So, I mean, Moog. Sorry, argument. Is Moog the way it should be said? So I'm happy to be told. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Argument. Please correct me. Anyway, I will do my best to interpret it. I'm no expert on anything. Trust me, I just like music. So, but anyway, the band themselves. Let's talk a little bit about them, who they were, where they came from. So German act from, I mean, I believe they're roughly they were certainly from the Ruhr, the industrial area of the Ruhr, which influenced the sound quite a bit and influenced the look in some periods. They always had an incredible look, but not always the robotic aspect of it. Obviously, these guys didn't dress like that all the time. But they did adopt, particularly in the Trans-Europe Express period, a certain, as I say, retro-futuristic look, which I really, really enjoyed. That kind of 1930s engineering. Then they moved more into the robotic stuff. So certainly a number of interesting looks. I'm still waiting for it, like Moog. So it is Moog, argument is saying. Well, anyway, I'm going to get it wrong. As I say, I've been to see them a couple of times. So the band themselves, Florian Schneider, one of the two principal founding members, who sadly passed away in 2020. He founded the band in 1970 with Ralph Hutter. There's been we'll talk about what I would call the classic lineup, but there's been obviously members in their early experimental days came and went, and many more members since. Funnily enough, Florian Schneider had a group called Piss Off before he formed Kraftwerk, which I think he may well have pronounced it Peace Off, of course. But, so Schneider was one of the founding members, and then Ralph Hutter, who is still there today, was the other main guy. It was really Florian and Ralph. Schneider played keyboards, this is Ralph. Schneider played keyboards, electronics, and vocals, but a lot of the early albums played flute and violin as well. They were pretty much multi-instrumentalists, but the early flute stuff, he usually modified it electronically in some way as well. But some really beautiful flute passages, even as far late as Autobahn on that album. That's exactly what I said. So the flute appeared in a lot of the early stuff. The early albums were really a little bit, there was guitar, bass, drums, and other more traditional instruments on them as well as the electronics. But Ralph Hutter, another co-founder, still out today, did a lot of the keyboards, vocals, plus other instruments early on. These guys are guys that would turn their hands to anything in the studio, including creating their own instruments. Now, although they've got a reputation as recluses, Ralph Hutter did do this another interesting advert for Bifora watches, which I don't know what, I love this. I think this is a great advert. I particularly like the owl, which doesn't seem to quite fit with the Kraftwerk look, but hey, So as Davina is saying, Dusseldorf, the capital city of North Rhine-Westphalia and the most populous state of Germany, heart of the industrial area, and I think that's where Kraftwerk's Kling Klang studio is that they've had for many, many, many decades. So Ralph Hutter today in performance looks a bit like this, as the whole band does, of course. So also what I would call the sort of the classic period that I like so much, from 1973 to 87, Wolfgang Flür was first of all joined as he was an actual drummer, but became the percussionist in the band, which meant learning and creating all these electronic percussion sounds and playing them live. He was on the albums Autobahn to Computer World, so a pretty peak period. And then Karl Bartos was another member of what I'd call that classic period from 75 to 1990. Karl-Heinz Bartos, another percussionist and writer, did come up with a lot of the influential beats, such as the song Numbers, which became big in the hip-hop world. And then he worked on the albums Radioactivity to The Mix. But there have been many other members early on, and since Fleur and Bartos departed. They actually came out of a developing German music scene in the late 60s, which was attempting to create a very specifically German sound. Sometimes, and many people didn't like the term, dubbed krautrock in the English world. But they were trying to be very different from the dominant Anglo-American scene. So it was a very experimental, avant-garde, free-form, jam-based sound with some jazz origins. Not necessarily stuff that I was heavily into. And I certainly remember a couple of the names of the bands at the time. But it's a very different from even the Anglo-American progressive rock. They were trying to create something German. You can see them here tucked away in the corner. You can see Ralph, Florian, but also they had a drummer at that point, early drummer, which was Klaus Dinger, who also went to form a band called Now or Neu, who were big on that scene. So a live drummer at this point. This is from 1970. There's footage of this on YouTube. Florian playing the flute and Ralph with the various keyboards. So slightly different look with the drummer. The other bands on that scene, and krautrock was a weird term. I mean, it even applied to bands like the Scorpions eventually. A band called Can, not the town in France, but just C-A-N, Can. They were big movers on that scene and worked with the guys in Kraftwerk. They're all from different cities in Germany, but they collaborated a lot. I do remember them being mentioned a lot. I never quite got into it because it was a bit more free-form jamming. But they did have quite a big impact. Managed to have a couple of albums that did pretty well in Europe, like Tego Mego, which I remember at the time. It was the sort of thing that older friends of my siblings would have, especially if they were at university. So then there was also a band that many people are familiar with, the Tangerine Dream, another prime movers in this experimental electronic scene, including a lot of soundtracks. They had a pretty big album in the early 70s in Britain called Phaedra, or Phaedra, depending on how you pronounce it. I do recall this particular one did make, it was one of the first albums on Virgin Records, along with Mike Oldfield's Tubular Bells. It did pretty well. So they were perhaps not as jam-based, but definitely experimental, but heavily leaning on those electronic soundscapes. So, and I know various people in the chat are mentioning other acts, so that is fantastic. Wellenstrom mentions Connie Plank, who produced a lot of these bands from this scene, including the first 4 Kraftwerk films up to Autobahn, I think. I'm sure Wellenstrom will correct me if I'm wrong. This is Neu, who Klaus Dinger, the Kraftwerk drummer, early drummer, formed, and Michael Rother, who also played with Kraftwerk early on, another big influential German. And there was Amon Duel, who, amongst other things, were connected to the Red Army faction. So interesting political times tied up with this music. And I do love this. Again, it's not particularly my favourite music, but I do love this cover album by Amon Duel. So that was the scene. They were definitely trying to create their own thing, do something different from Anglo-American rock, and you cannot fault them for that. But Connie Plank was mentioned, produced many of these acts, then went on to produce Devo, Eurythmics, Ultravox. I believe he worked with U2 and various other acts in the late 70s, early 80s, and 90s, including some mainstream Western rock acts. So, yeah, Williamson says Tangerine Dream were rooted in Berlin. The electronic music scene in Berlin was different. So, from what I understand, each of these major German centres had their own scene, but they did collaborate together, and they also shared in Connie Plank many of them actually. So I like what Argument says about propaganda. I'm assuming he's talking about the album Duel. They started the industrial sound, but wanted to be like the Beach Boys. Very different scene. There's a lot of great clips, especially Kraftwerk early on in 1970 playing. Gives you an idea of what they were trying to achieve, and these other German bands. A very, very deep scene that I know very little about. I would never claim to know a lot about it. I remember some of the albums as a kid being in record stores. I remember my older brother and his friends listening to some of that stuff, particularly in the students. And me, I was still into glam rock at the time. A little bit young for it. Yeah, but there were other acts in the early 70s in what you would call the mainstream or Anglo rock sphere. They were into this stuff too. Some of whom, actually, like Brian Eno, obviously worked, first of all, with rock music, but many, many other acts. Very big experimental avant-garde artist. He actually went to see Kraftwerk gigs in the early 70s in Germany. He was very into what they were doing. He's become a huge influence himself. Mike Oldfield, one of my favourites, although Mike's a multi-instrumentalist and plays a lot of guitar. He considers guitar his first instrument. He was hugely into electronics and studio manipulation too at an early time. There's made albums, completely electronic albums. Yeah, Brian, was probably about to get on stage with either Roxy Music or his some of his post-Roxy stuff. And he obviously, somebody mentioned, worked heavily with David Bowie, who was very interested in but Oldfield, hugely into this stuff. I'm a big fan of his electronic noodlings, which he put on a lot of his albums. Great studio manipulator as well. Now, the Floyd, Pink Floyd were heavily into this stuff too, particularly in this period up to and including Dark Side of the Moon. So the 2 or 3 albums before that, you can see them twiddling about there with Sequencer, I think it is. Right,
yeah, a lot of the prog rock bands really jumped on the synthesizer bandwagon and were kind of the first to really play around with it and see what you could do with that sound.
And you look at Dark Side of the Moon, there's whole sections that are featuring the sequenced sound that they played about with.
Yeah, and I mean, Rush has to be one of the first to really jump down that rabbit hole in like 76.
Yeah, and I don't know how much Pink Floyd would have been aware. I think they probably would have been aware of some of that German scene because they must have played festivals with some of those bands.
Oh, yeah.
But they got into this quite heavily. And see the light at that period, the Rick Wright's stage setup. It's got a lot of these instruments that were being used by the German bands like Kraftwerk as well. They didn't obviously go quite as far because they were still playing as a traditional rock band, albeit prog rock. So, but they were keen to incorporate it. Stevie Wonder too was mentioned as heavily into this stuff.
Even a lot of like proto metal bands like Rainbow was heavily into synthesizers at this point.
Yeah.
Queen was getting into that.
I think one of the differences between a band like Queen getting into it and Rainbow was that they were using already established equipment, whereas a lot of these guys like Kraftwerk and Pink Floyd were figuring out what to do with what was available in 72, 73.
True, yeah.
And we're going to look at some of that gear because I find it fascinating. I've got a whole section on that.
And a lot of times they were building their own rigs because there was no such thing as like a standard setup by then. It was basically your engineer made it.
Yeah. Thank you, Vellenstrom, for all this info. Cluster were another big act in that area. I think they worked with Brian Eno later on as well, and Harmonia. Two more of those big experimental German acts. So, argument sold his synth to Pete Townsend. Well, that's pretty cool. I hope he gave you a good price for it. But Pete was into this stuff quite heavily in his own home studio. You can see him sitting in his setup here. So the stuff that ends up on, well, we all know Babo O'Reilly and Won't Get Fooled Again. That sequenced electronic sound was created by him in his own studio. He was heavily into that stuff. Which made performing on stage difficult without even a keyboard player. So Pete, that's the Who notoriously had to resort to tapes, which are notoriously difficult to use. Caused an awful lot of breakdowns. Tapes would stop playing, they would stretch, they would break. So you'd be halfway through Babo O'Reilly and be gone. But, of course, Kraftwerk themselves and other bands that are heavily into electronics struggled with how to do that stuff on stage too. And we're definitely going to talk a little bit about that as we get into the equipment they used. But it wasn't all plain sailing. Obviously, ELP from the prog side, heavily into this. I don't know how the hell you could patch that thing up there to get.
That's just insanity.
I often wonder how they did it. Yeah, I mean, it's like, okay, 1 or 2, got it. Okay, 3 or 4, maybe we can figure that out. Just incredible, these moves.
Reminds me of like most like 70s and 80s sci-fi shows where the engineer just patched it back together. It's literally just wires everywhere, and it's just like, is it going to work? Maybe. Yeah.
That's right, maybe not. And the carting, I mean, speaking of the roadies that we know, carting that gear around was pretty tough.
Yeah, just like it might work perfectly, might catch fire. We don't know.
One of the stories that, Kraftwerk not only had to figure out how to simplify some of the stuff that they did in their studio like this so they could play it on stage, so they didn't have that rat's nest, but also had to build custom cases to carry everything in, custom aluminum cases. So so that was a major thing that they did. They were designers and creators and patented a lot of stuff as well, because they couldn't, although you see some of their era, the late 70s, mid to late 70s, a lot of sequencers on stage with them, they didn't want to have all this either. It just wasn't practical. And they did play live. They toured a lot. So this is Tony Visconti and David Bowie's setup when they were recording together. So quite, don't get me wrong, I don't know all the equipment, but I find it fascinating. I can see at least one, I think is a sequencer there towards the front. So they did a lot of that stuff too. Bowie got heavily into this. Tony Visconti was also into it. And he also adopted a style and a look around that thin white Duke thing, getting off the trains and videos. Very, very Trans Europe Express inspired. Yeah. There's some great chat going on here, and thank you for that. So, yeah, Wallenstrom says, I love Brian Eno's music for airports. It's really good for a nap, and I mean that in a positive way. It is. It's ambient sound. It's actually really beautiful. I love that stuff too. This is an interesting one from Poison Ice Cream. Did you know Bowie wrote Life on Mars because they rejected his lyrics for the French song that turned into Sinatra's My Way? That is really interesting. Well, Life on Mars is a killer track, so I'm glad he got rejected originally, because then we got Life on Mars.
Right.
That's right. This is the David Bowie stylophone, which Kraftwerk used as well, particularly around the Computer World era and live on stage for some of the tracks from that. They had their own stylophone. Do you remember the stylophone?
I don't know.
That's before my time.
Yeah, we all had one as a kid, and the novelty soon wore off because it was like pretty limited. But if you knew what you were doing, like Kraftwerk used it really neatly on Pocket Calculator and certain other tracks. But David Bowie was quite keen on it too. I actually wouldn't mind getting one again. They're quite a neat little. They were marketed as a toy, but you could actually use them. Especially did it loud. Another guy I'm quite keen on is a Japanese guy called Tomita, who did things like Snowflakes or Dancing. And I know that Kraftwerk worked with other Japanese acts like Richie Sakamoto later and were big admirers, but slightly earlier on you had Tomita, who did a lot of pure electronic stuff. This Snowflakes or Dancing is a beautiful album. Which I've got. So I've always, even back in that era, I did like a lot of that stuff, but Kraftwerk grabbed me partly because they were more accessible than a lot of the hardcore German experimental stuff, and I liked that accessibility. They were always they always had the pop edge still to them. Even Lars and Florian still wanted to have a 4-piece act, especially on stage, because they saw that as the natural band number, 4 members on stage. So it was they were not determined to overthrow the system. They just wanted to change the system to do their own sound and music in it. So taking a little look at some of the gear, I think, before we talk about some of the music. A lot of people in the chat will have a lot more information about this stuff than me. So some of the gear they use, and I'm particularly focusing on not so much the later stuff where they had access to the synthesizers that were being more produced for the market then. So your Rolands, your Yamahas, and your Fairlights. At the time they were trying to do this stuff in the early 70s, right through the Pocket Calculator era, they were trying to do something different that perhaps couldn't be done or wasn't being done. And a lot of that was done in Kling Klang, which you saw as a laboratory to create sound, and using not only instruments they created or adapted themselves, but actually doing stuff in the studio that would give them the electronic sound they wanted. So there's Kling Klang is a fairly secretive place. I think they even kept the actual location pretty secret for years because they didn't want to be disturbed when they were working. But it did look a little bit like this at the time. This is probably 74, 75. I don't know if Poison Ice Cream is talking about who somebody mentioned earlier. Oh, I don't know about the Sue. Somebody mentioned Walter Carlos earlier, which I've actually got the switched on back. Walter Carlos, who became Wendy Carlos. Eventually, he was an early pioneer, typically adapting existing classical material rather than writing new material. That's one thing about Kraftwerk. It was all original material all the way, apart from one live example I have of them playing somebody else's tune, which I'm going to show later on. Not sure if I was thinking of Wendy Carlos would be the one that did the Moog, a lot of Moog stuff. Also, I'm going to say it wrong and annoy somebody. Sorry. So what did they do? I mean, this is an example of a later setup of theirs, just a map of it. This is probably around about the Computer World Tour era. A lot of gear to set up and go right. So if we think guitars and their amps go wrong, there's a lot of wiring here.
Yeah.
Oh God, yeah.
A lot of patching. There's mixers, laptops, sequencers.
I'm wondering how many times the phrase "one goes out, they all got out" got yelled on stage during the pre-show.
Now, argument. We'll have to have a look at your. I'm gonna, if I get the chance before the end of the show, I'll go look that up so we can see what you're doing, because I'd love to see that. A lot of what they do now is it's all just 4 laptops, and that controls everything. The sound, it's synced to the fantastic light shows they do on the screens. They've even had a 3D show, which was fabulous. And now it's all pretty much, other than Ralph, who does play some live keyboards, the rest is usually triggered by stuff that's controlled by the laptops, already done. In this day and age, they still had to trigger everything using all the keyboard or whatever they had in front of them with all that gear at the back. So different kind of roadieing, I guess.
Well, then you even have certain acts too, like the guy who wrote the soundtrack for the anime Berserk, Susumu Hirasawa.
Oh yeah,
He does a lot of electronic stuff, but he does it all via. It's not touch. It's almost, and it might be motion controlled, or it's him breaking like an infrared sensor with his hand. The beam coming out of that to trigger certain noises.
Yeah.
So he does do live performances that I've seen, and I'm like, what the hell is this guy doing?
So yeah, indeed, it was more a case of how do you trigger the sound you want rather than just playing something, because yes, there were synths, and we're going to look at some of those, but the drum side and the percussion side particularly was hard for them to do, because it wasn't just a case of playing an electronic drum. They had to trigger that sound in a drum machine. So some of the stuff they had to do to get that was quite tricky. So one of the things that they did use, though, that many other acts used, were the mini Moogs. I'll say Moog because I'm just ignorant, so I'll say mini Moog. Not that others didn't use them, and it was the first probably widely accessible synthesizer. I mean, even the Beatles used one on Abbey Road. In fact, they'd used a Mellotron back in Sgt. Pepper, but George Harrison was the guy, funnily enough, that was into that stuff in the Beatles. But it was very integral to their early work. Monophonic leads and bass lines, so not polyphonic, which was a big issue, but they dealt with that in another way. Became a bit of a signature, not new or inventive, but by the time they got to Autobahn, they were using it in such a way that they created those bass lines, for instance. The pulsating bass line stuff that repeated was initially created on here. And you saw that became huge, of course, with things like Giorgio Moroder and all those disco hits like I Feel Love. That took that as the blueprint came from what Kraftwerk were doing on these albums. The Mini Moog was huge for them. But to get to the drum side, they had to make their own percussion pads for live performance to allow them to play these synthesized drum sounds in a live way with an actual percussionist playing it. And this triggered an actual drum machine. This wasn't the drum machine. This was just triggering it, but they also had to use pedals because this had no depth to it. You hit it, it just made one triggering. It wasn't like you hit it harder, it triggers harder. It was just the same. So they used a lot of pedals too, and that would feed back to drum machines that they had programmed to do certain things. So they created this stuff themselves. We've got a little bit of a video we're going to show them using some of this stuff on a British show called Tomorrow's World. In fact, that'd be a good point for me to actually show that. So let's share this wonderful footage of Kraftwerk on the British television show Tomorrow's World 1975. This was Tomorrow's World was a long-running science show on in the evening in the UK. I loved it. It was all about new science developments, new science stuff. Great show, fantastic presenters, and Kraftwerk were on it twice. I'm going to show both clips. This is 1975.
Kraftwerk have a name for this. It's Maschinenmusik. The sounds are created at their laboratory in Dusseldorf, programmed, then recreated on stage with the minimum of fuss. This is Autobahn, based, say the group, on the rhythm of trucks, cars and passing bridges heard while driving through Germany. Last year, they removed the last recognizable instrument, a violin, and built these synthetic drums. Each disc gives a different sound. Rolls, bongos, snares, just by completing the contact with the spring steel battens. Next year, Kraftwerk hope to eliminate the keyboards altogether and build jackets with electronic lapels which can be played by touch.
So that's a really neat clip from Tomorrow's World, and just as people in the chat are saying that now you can go out and buy an emulator, software emulator, or sound banks that have all those analog sounds and make it sound like that. But they had to do it. This is why I consider them pioneers. They had to come up with this stuff in order to get that sound. So true innovators. I think it's I take my hat off to them. But his argument said it's the Beach Boys track Fun, Fun, Fun. Autobahn does sound a little like Fun, Fun, Fun. It's their version of a Beach Boys thing. That's why I love the pop edge they had to them. They made Autobahn, 22 minutes of just pure beauty. It's gorgeous. All those car sounds going under bridges, cars honking. It's a beautiful, beautiful track. We'll talk a little bit more of that later. I do want to catch up though with a super chat from our great friend Christian DeLorne for $5 Canadian. Bonjour, everybody. I just needed to find an excuse to give Brian my money. So as of yesterday, I'm Brian's newest groupie. Do with that what you may. You mean groupie level on the memberships? Well, if that's true, we'd have to play the video for the groupie members, which apparently is this one. So thank you, Christian, for that $5 super chat. Appreciate it very much. Really enjoying everybody on the chat that's talking about this gear. And we're going to go back to showing more of that. They know way more about it than I do. I'm just fascinated by it when I look at it and hear people talking about it. There's lots of great chat, argument, and Wellstrom are covering this stuff in the chat. So look for their chats talking about the details of some of this gear. But yeah, that, and then behind that there was and this isn't an exhaustive list of everything they used. It's just some of the things I found were very interesting. The drum machines themselves. So they had things like the Elka Drummer 1, where the pads, I guess, would feed back to. This is more of a it was triggered by the pads, I believe I'm right in saying. And then an even earlier drum machine, which I think still existed and was started in the 60s, the Maestro Rhythm King, with a number of sounds available. And I'm guessing there's people collect this stuff now, and they still have a lot of this gear. Fabulous. I just, as a guy who used to be an avionics engineer and into the electronic stuff, I always found it fascinating. I kind of wish I'd bought a lot of it at the time myself, except I couldn't afford it. But they used stuff like this, so feeding back with the pads and the pedals, and they created their own rhythm machines too. So a lot of work to get that sound just right. Something that they did for a while, and I'm not sure there's any actual video footage of them using it, is they used a laser drum cage on the 1976 tour, which they stood inside and they broke the lasers to make the sounds.
Huh.
So that's a pretty neat idea. There's a still photograph of it here.
That's high tech for the 70s, because
76
lasers were really only a few years old as a technology.
Yeah, I mean, you had people like The Who using them, or Blue Oyster Cult using them as stage lights, but to do this with them, quite revolutionary. You can see, by the way, they're still dressed in just normal clothes.
Well, as normal as German.
Yeah. Apparently, according to Fleur, it didn't work very well. It failed at a show in Liverpool, and they didn't know for a while, so they're flailing around and nothing was happening. People thought they were directing traffic, he said. So, which is such a shame, because that is a great and very early attempt to do something very different. And of course, these guys, well, the Wolfgang, I think, was an actual drummer, but they didn't, and this was still drumming, it's just in a different way, not using a kit. It was using a different way of making that sound. So that's why they had two percussionists in the band. Great idea, though. I wish there was some video of it. I couldn't find any. So another big feature of their sound was vocoders, some of which they created their own gear and even patented their own gear. They gave them that robotic, mechanized quality of their voices. So you listen to the robots, for instance. This is an early custom rig of theirs, I think, that they created. But they also used things like the EMS Vocoder 1000. Which others had it too, but they incorporated that heavily into their stuff. But I think, I don't know if anybody sounded quite like the robotic sound in some of the vocals that they got. The robots being a great example. It takes now, of course, you get the software, you can do it, but Kraftwerk had that nailed, and some of that was they created their own gear. They had a thing called the RoboVox that they patented. Whether this is an actual version of that or not, I don't know, because they're very difficult to find photographs of. But they patented that. They worked along with a couple of other guys, and I'm sorry I've forgotten the guy's name, but I'll find it later, to do this stuff. So they patented a system for a method for synthesizing singing in real time. They dubbed the RoboVox. Kind of used a MIDI chip and a phonetic keyboard. So that was one of the things they used. They also, though, used this little beauty, which I remember people having, the Texas Instruments Speak and Spell, which you could type in a phrase and it would speak it. And then, of course, you could type that out into various equipment to do something with that sound. Used this on Computer World, but I think you can still buy these. I'm not sure they're cheap, but at the time they were like, I remember people had them. You could type in something and you could use it to translate stuff. So you type it in and it would type out the German or the French, speak the German or French phrase of it. Quite the thing. Texas Instruments, so they used those. If you can't pronounce Entschuldigung Sie, your computer can. Now this was high tech at the time for the public. I don't know if anybody in the chat's ever had one. I do remember I didn't have one, although I had a pretty good Texas Instruments calculator, but I did know people that had these. Quite the gear. Something else they used a lot of was a Vaco or Vaco orchestron. So it was like a mellotron. This is an adapted mellotron. But mellotrons being, I think, tape-based, could only do a limited number of loops for that sound that you were holding down. The ebony and ivory, yeah. The Vaco orchestron could do it could do prolonged repetition of a sound. So you could create, for instance, a synthetic choir sound with it, which they did on Radioactivity, I think. So these were not as popular as the mellotrons, but a few bands did have them. And you could do the same as a mellotron. You could store sound samples on tape, replay at different pitches. Had an early version of an optical disc. They came in a dual keyboard version as well. These are, people love these now. They got people that are into retro stuff. Argument saying samples for Blue Monday, yeah. So it gave them a lot more flexibility than a mellotron. It could do a prolonged, sustained sound as opposed to just a few seconds. But this apparently, and again, I'm not an expert, was there's a Yes used it. There's an advert for the Vaco polyphonic as opposed to just monophonic, of course. Monophonic, one note, polyphonic, entire chords. There's one that Yes used. There's an advert for Yes. I think this is in the Patrick Moraz era of Yes. So some people did have them. Pretty neat piece of gear. I think I saw Pink Floyd had one as well on stage. But that was actually based upon this little beauty, which was a Mattel Optigan, which was basically considered like a toy almost. So these were even earlier versions of the orchestra. The orchestra was based upon these Mattel. I don't know if anybody in the chat remembers having one of these. It came with 8 sounds: choir, violin, Hammond organ, flute, cello, and saxophone, pipe organ, and French horn. This was used on Trans-Europe Express and the Man Machine, as well as the Vaco. But Mattel made these. So God knows how much it costs to get an old one now.
They were really branching out in the 60s. I mean, they made, musical instruments, apparently. They made all the hand guards for the M16, which is why it got referred to as the toy gun. Yeah.
I mean, I didn't know this. I'd heard of the Vaco orchestra because I'd seen certain bands talking about using it. I'd never heard of the Mattel Optigan. So it's pretty neat.
I'd never even seen this thing. That's actually, it looks like a pretty cool little thing. It's like a little compact.
It almost looks like a church organ.
It does. Yeah. It's so cool. And I'm sure people sell them for, and you can emulate the sound of these now, or emulate them on software, so as if you're actually
I will always be on the purist side of that argument. Like, I know you can emulate everything with solid state amps and stuff like that now, but I will always use tube types because you don't have to emulate that sound. You just get it.
Yeah.
All you have to do is run enough current through there and you'll get the fuzz.
I'm pretty sure guys that are heavily into the, as you say, the pure analog experience seek these out.
One of the bands I listen to that's been around since late 80s, early 90s, a Finnish band called Amorphous. They've used analog keyboards from the get-go. And it's kind of weird hearing a death metal band also sound like the Doors at the same time.
Yeah,
Right.
that's right. Yeah, that's a good.
Like, hang on, those sounds don't match.
Yeah, that's a good one. I like that example. That's why I wanted you to come up with a few of those, because I know Kraftwerk have got a little bit of influence on a lot of influence on industrial genre.
Oh yeah,
The metal genre. Maybe Rammstein obviously is an example of a band that perhaps has certain elements that could be Kraftwerk inspired. But, so other stuff they used, and I don't want to go too far with this, but there's a couple of things. EMS synth, the AK5 portable analog synthesizer with built-in keyboard.
looks like a piece of test equipment.
Yeah, it does.
Seriously.
I mean, the era that we're talking about in Kling Klang, they'd be using oscilloscopes to make music, to measure music.
Well, I mean,
That looks like something you'd see in the original Star Trek.
Yeah.
Right? It looks like it should be sticking out of the wall of the movie set somewhere.
Yeah. Argument knows about that one. Yeah. And Millenstrom. These guys know a lot. And thank you for being in the chat, guys. I know you guys seem to have a lot of knowledge about this and are users of this equipment. That's great. Because I'm fascinated by it. I don't know a lot about it, but it's fascinating stuff. Spent all my life looking at guitars, so it's nice when I divert onto this. Yeah, the EMS synth AKS creates a lot of that swirling noise that you get in a lot of tracks. Futuristic. Autobahn uses it a lot. Then this little baby, the ARP Odyssey, which comes in obviously over the years in various flavors, a duophonic analog synthesizer. And that allowed them to do a lot of complex layered sounds. Used extensively on the Man Machine, which is such a great album, and the Model, which is such a great track. And as I say, other acts did use them, but Kraftwerk really used these. And often, though, to put that stuff together, they needed sequencers. And they used various different kinds. This is the Synthorama sequencer, just one of the ones they used. And you can see them here, banks of them here in that late 70s stage setup that they used, which again must have been a lot of fun to set up. Synthorama is a pretty good one. That was made by for them by I think Matten and Vikers were the people that made them for them. And Dieter Doepfer worked with them a lot. That's the guy that worked with them. I was trying to remember his name earlier, making some of this gear and patenting it. Also, the MAQ 163 MIDI analog sequencer was something they used as well. By Dieter Doepfer. This was one. Doepfer, sorry, was one of his hybrid MIDI and analog sequencer. Another neat thing they used, though, in the later years was they used this ARP Doepfer Mowgli MIDI glove, so they could gesture to make sounds. And these adapted game controllers. So they used the game. You could use the game controller to do stuff as well as you're waving it about. Kinect and Nintendo Y controllers, Nintendo Power Glove, stuff like that. So they made a few. They only made a few of these. They were available commercially, but not very many of them. So as Davina says, and others are talking about Doepfer, and forgive me if I pronounce his name wrong. Oh, Wellenstrom makes a good point. The typical John Carpenter sound came from ARPs because he did all those great soundtracks. So something else they used was pocket calculators, obviously on Pocket Calculator, the track. And stylophones, as I mentioned earlier, the stylophone. Such fun was being had with those stylophones. So like this is the period that's fascinating because they still had to make and adapt stuff. Later on, they got into the Roland Yamaha DX7s, the Fairlight CMIs, same gear that other bands were starting to use in the early 80s and onwards, and the MIDI stuff. So they didn't have any of that when they started. They had all this other gear. So, and nowadays, this is kind of what their stage setup looks like. It's pretty much laptops and a couple of other pieces. Everything's everything's already set up. A lot of the things they have to do is just trigger it and trigger certain sequences. There is, however, an entire video out there of things going wrong in Kraftwerk shows. I couldn't show it today because it's probably would be, there's too much music, it would get copyright. But go seek that out, where things just stop dead on stage, or the wrong rhythm track's playing, or something else goes horribly wrong, the lights go out, power goes off. So just like analog bands with guitars, things go wrong. They have to deal with it live, scurrying off to find out who pulled the plug, that kind of thing. So, but their setup now is incredible. And it's great for them because they don't have to take any of that gear with them now. It's just laptops, a few other bits and pieces, obviously the sound stuff. And it's such a relief to them that they can play all that without the huge amounts of gear. So that's...
You don't have to spend like 4 hours setting up all the equipment and checking every circuit, making sure it's all good.
What was
quite these shorts and cables?
Yeah, right.
What was quite funny was one of the clips of things go wrong. They're playing Autobahn, it just stops dead, and Ralph says, "I think we ran out of petrol." So I hope you enjoyed that fascinating look into some of their gear. I find it. This is why they're pioneers. This is why they're important. What the sounds they made, they have to work. They had to work hard to get those sounds going. So, fair play to them. So, I want to look a little bit of their albums, if that's okay. Let me show on stream. So, somebody did a set of coasters with their album covers. And one thing you'll notice is they've actually got older album covers on there, which they've since changed with a new. So you'll find a lot of versions of the album, especially the earlier ones, where they've changed the covers. But they started out, their first 3 albums were still using some traditional instruments. Kraftwerk 1, 2, and the third one, Florian and Ralph. There's a couple of great tracks on these, though. The track that you'll see, one of the tracks you'll see on the 1970 live clip that on TV that they did, it's called Ruckzuck. It's a really good track, pretty driving electronic track, brilliant. Still with traditional drum kit, etc. They had some bass on some of these as well. But then they slimmed down to the key pair of Ralph and Florian for the third album. Started leaning more towards the electronic sounds. Still some flute and violin, etc. They themselves consider the early stuff kind of year zero. You can see Conrad Planck's engineering, and although by this time Ralph and Florian are producing because they wanted to get that sound, but there's still some live drums and so on in here, but definitely moving more towards electronic stuff. But it wasn't until I do like, and they had the Ralph and Florian neon light setup for the names, which I thought was a nice touch because they really were never very expressive guys on stage. Didn't really talk a lot about themselves. But to have the names in front, at least people know who it was. And they're still not dressing like robots either. But you can see that's a kind of a neat setup they've got there in the studio. There's still some string-based instruments. You've got the flutes, etc. But obviously banks of other stuff. Ralph does play a lot of live, still plays live keyboard stuff as well. But then came the big one, an album which amazingly, or not amazingly because it's a brilliant album, actually became a top chart hit as an album and a single in both the US and the UK and all over Europe. Really came as a big surprise, I guess, to everybody because the A side is a 22-minute electronic journey mimicking a car ride down the autobahn. And it's a defining moment in electronic music. My good lady wife, who's not that up on Kraftwerk, she went, "Oh, that's Kraftwerk," when I played it to her. Because everyone's heard Autobahn in some form or other. I mean, the hit single was 4 minutes long, edited down, but the full album track is a beauty. And it introduces, it's full electronic. For me, it's that hypnotic, rhythmic sound. I'd love to play the whole thing for you. Heard a bit of it on the Tomorrow's World. Absolutely grabbed me at the time when I was like 13, 14. The two covers there. The old cover is the one on the left. The newer one is the one on the right. Just awesome stuff. Absolutely. Vigilante says Kraftwerk may be the most important group ever. A lot of people, I mean, I am a huge Beatles fan, and the Beatles' influence is enormous. But Kraftwerk, many people, particularly those who like more experimental stuff, and where that went with dance and other things, consider Kraftwerk to be equally, if not more important. I think there's an argument to be made for that for sure. And this album introduced the real Kraftwerk sound. Autobahn was my first ever album yet. I had a cassette copy I recorded of somebody, so because I couldn't afford to buy albums. But the other tracks on the album, Autobahn gets all the credit, but I do love the tracks on the other side. Still a little bit of flute on one of those, but Comiton Melody 2, for instance, has got a really great driving sound on it, which influences a lot of future electro-pop stuff. Lovely album. I don't think they were sitting in the back of that car, though. And as you can see, they've not quite adopted the futuristic look yet. So brilliant album, as I say, hit the US and British charts both as an album and a single, gathered tons of airplay, still heard a lot today, and there's good reason for that. Established them as a band in their own right. They started touring the UK and appearing on television shows, as we saw with Tomorrow's World. So now OMD, we're going to mention a little later. Orchestral Maneuvers in the Dark, good friends with Kraftwerk. Absolutely adore OMD. I think they're out on tour again now as well, which I'm hoping to see them. So lots of bands, particularly British electro-pop bands, absolutely inspired by this. We'll have a little tiny sample of some of those later. So moving on from Autobahn, there's one of the singles, 7-inch singles of it. Not at all expected that somebody coming out of the German experimental scene would start having hit singles in the UK and US, but it was a very, very radio and pop friendly sound, I think. Still adore this album, play it all the time. Next album, Radioactivity, 1975. Started that kind of more of the themed albums. So the album's more focusing on nuclear power and energy in general, radio communication. They still play a lot of Radioactivity, the title track, live, but it also broke down, rather than having 22-minute long songs, broke it down into more 3-4 minute songs. They didn't want to be known for just purely extended pieces of work. Radioactivity title track was a hit as well. Fully performed with electronic instruments, this album, no flute or anything on it. And again, introduced more of that rhythmic template they were striving to use. I'd recommend everybody listen to some really great tracks on there, some great pop tracks. It's getting towards that rhythmic sound, minimalist rhythmic sound. Great imagery too. That's the 7-inch single. Now comes a really, really important one, Trans-Europe Express. As you can see, they've changed their look a lot now. This is the retro-futurism of the Metropolis type, or early 1930s European look. The cover on the left top corner is the original cover. This one on the right is more the new look that they have. Highly influential, talking about travel, technology, engineering, the big trains, super fast, sleek trains, further reinforces that electronic sound, but it's a cornerstone of a lot of things, not only electronic music, but dance and hip hop music. For instance, Africa Bambaataa, huge hip hop artist back in the day. I remember the video, seeing it on television a lot. Planet Rock, one of those first major hip hop tracks, uses the backing from Trans Europe Express. Also, there's a bit of Numbers in it, a track called Numbers from later on. It's a cornerstone of that. So you could say both West and East Coast hip hop in America, we're going to talk about West Coast a little later, were hugely influenced by this album and later ones. But this one, particularly the track Trans Europe Express, started a whole genre almost. You know, these DJs would play it in New York and then they'd put things over the top of it, that rhythm from Trans Europe Express. So absolutely showstopper and seminal. Not necessarily large hit singles. These were hit albums in the UK and Europe particularly, but they also, the track Metal on Metal plays a lot. They play it a lot live to this day. Listen to that one. Really, really good. Industrial sounding. And Showroom Dummies, which is just a fun track that they later did a video for in 1982, and there was a re-release of it. I have a little clip of that. Tiny little clip for corporate.
We go into a club, and there we start to dance.
So, showing their dancing skills, which we're going to talk about again a little later. So Trans Europe Express was hugely influential. Great album. The title track is very dramatic, but also has that rhythm. A lot of those dramatic chord pieces. Devo, inspired Devo, an awful lot. Connie Plank, in fact, worked with Devo. Devo took the more staccato rhythmic side of Kraftwerk, rather than the smoother side, which they could also do with a lot of. I often find their sound warm. A lot of people say about Kraftwerk, all the electronic stuff's cold. Kraftwerk are a very warm sound, enveloping, hypnotic, rhythmic, a lot of beautiful melodies over the top. They could be extremely warm as opposed to a cold, hard electronic sound. So then another big one, there's the Showroom Dummies single, but they adopted that look and did the whole Showroom Dummies video, which is quite neat. So then another one, which is harkening back to the Metropolis look, I guess. A lot of people did question the imagery of this, given the but they were taking the wrong end of the shtick. Kraftwerk weren't trying to pay homage to any nasty people that we know of came out of Germany. It was quite the opposite. They were reclaiming a look that had been that retro-futuristic look that had existed before that. And it built on the reputation they'd built from the previous albums. This is one of my favorite albums of all time. The Man Machine. It's got the robotic rhythms, futuristic themes. Again, not yet reaching the sort of computer stuff that they talked about later. This is talking about space, futuristic cities, the neon lights, going through even a city of today, and that feeling that a city full of neon lights gives you. The robots, the model, beautiful, beautiful track. It's a classic album in any genre. One of the best ever made, in my humble opinion. And they did all their albums in German and English at this point. So this is the Mensch Machine, but they also did them in English. Limited vocals on a lot of their albums. There was actually quite a few vocals on this one. This is the Lego version, which I quite like, that somebody knocked up. It's a pretty new one, but obviously they're trying to appeal to the long-haired metal crowd with this one. The Robots, great track. It was a single, a minor hit at the time. This is 1978-79. Space Lab, absolutely beautiful. Gives you the impression you're going up in a shuttle towards the Space Lab Metropolis. The Model, everyone's probably heard The Model. She's a model and she's looking good. Used massively, lots of radio play. Wasn't a hit single at the time, was re-released in the UK in 1981 as a double A-side with Computer Love from the Computer World album, became a #1 hit single a couple of years later. So hugely popular in Europe and Britain. I'm not sure The Model was ever a hit in America. I know they played it on MTV a lot, the video for it. Massively influential electro-pop song. The beautiful neon lights, all the shimmering sounds on it, absolutely gorgeous, very hypnotic. Then the Man Machine further exploring that kind of robotic theme. So great album. I'd love to play more of it here, but for copyright reasons, I can't. But just phenomenal album by anybody's standards. Groundbreaking from 1978 as well. Nobody sounded like this in 78. A lot of people sounded like it after. I don't think they could ever quite capture the same feeling as Kraftwerk because they had something behind it as well, the human aspect that informed the themes. And they did want to be a successful pop group as well as experimental. So great stuff. Check that album out. There's the single of the Robots using kind of the Showroom Dummies image though. They actually built robots for it, of course, on stage and for the videos that they could use. And it just so happens we have another Tomorrow's World clip about that.
Meet Kraftwerk, or at least their robot doubles. The track, not surprisingly called The Robots, has just entered our pop charts. The German musicians that make up Kraftwerk are well known for their robotic style of performance, so it seemed a natural progression to have robot lookalikes. The Robots will be performing live as part of the band's tour this summer. Kraftwerk have always been a technically innovative band. In the early 70s, they were among the first to use synthesizers and rhythm sequencers, often building their own before they became commercially available. And the latest project is to build the robots. When this track's performed, the robots will become Kraftwerk and the humans will leave the stage. The same computer that generates the music then also controls the movements of the robots.
Yeah, it's really neat stuff, which is why they're always on Tomorrow's World. But I like the idea of they can leave the robots to play and they can go off and have a break. There's a lot of bands now who'd still love to do that. Hey, I'll get the cover band to play and I'll just sit in the back. Especially older artists, you know. So it's actually quite, yeah, you know what, let's just leave the robots. We don't need us. We're not interesting anyway. We'll go off and have a cup of tea. And having seen them do it live, it is pretty neat.
Let the automatons handle this one. I'm going for a beer.
That's right. I'm going for a beer, yes. German beer, of course. But yeah, great imagery this time. They really had the most fantastic imagery. It just sold the band absolutely well, absolutely perfectly. And they adapted it over the years. So now they're in the robotic model phase. Neon lights. I'd love to get hold of this 12-inch neon lights with the glowing vinyl. I think that's one of the ones that soaked up the light and then it would glow in the dark. And they were starting to get played in the dance world, these songs, which is why DJs like Africa Bambaataa and others turned on to them. Because you could put those tracks on and then do the whole layer stuff on top of them, you know. Pop Architects is a great way of putting it, Wellenstrom. So that achieved a lot of international success for the Man Machine. And then the next one, Computer World, they kind of brought it up to the new theme, becoming big at the time, of PCs, computing, And the song titles on this were, Computer World, Computer Love, Pocket Calculator. Pocket calculators were still really a pretty big thing. I mean, I was using them. It's still at the time. You didn't have a phone, you didn't have a PC, but you had a pocket calculator. So, Computer Love, Numbers, which became also important in that Planet Rock song because they use a little bit of that and the style of calling out the numbers. And it was more rhythmic, again, slightly more dance oriented with some of the backings, and very much directly influenced bands they were now competing with, particularly the Britpop electronic stuff that had started already by this time. So we're starting to compete with those guys. But still had a sort of class above some of them, I think. Forward looking, they were looking now to the digital age. Before their subject matter dealt with more engineering and retrofuturism, now they're looking forward. Pocket Calculator became a big hit single, and it's really great when you watch it being performed live. So I actually do have a clip of that. They came out, it was interesting because when I saw them on this tour in Birmingham, a lot of the stuff was behind the desks, but for Pocket Calculator, they came out the front of the stage with handheld stuff, including a stylophone and a pocket calculator they devised that could play certain things, and actually danced a bit and interacted with the audience, which was like, wow. Yeah, it was neat to see them come out there and smile a bit and interact because they're always very reserved, don't speak. But there was a lot of laughing and smiling and looking at the audience there with that one. I love that. Still a wonderful track. So James is asking, and I'm sure everybody would have an opinion on this, where do they rank in my top 5 bands? I don't know. I mean, I'm always difficult with this. I would say they're possibly my top 10, maybe not my top 5. The Man Machine, Autobahn, and Computer World are albums I still listen to all the time now, are definitely in my top 50 albums of all time. The Man Machine particularly is way up there. I've never really... Rankings are tough because they change from me from day to day. They're a very important band for me, despite my upbringing and leanings towards guitar-based heavy rock. Kraftwerk are a hugely important band, which is why I took the time to go see them twice in concert, But Computer World, 1981. Now, in fact, Computer Love, the track on here, Coldplay used the melody of it for one of their songs, Talk, which I'm not a big Coldplay fan, but they actually finally got a hold of Kraftwerk. Very difficult to get a hold of them, apparently, at Kling Klang. And eventually somebody sent them a message saying, call this number. They called it, and I think it was Ralph that answered. And they said, can we use the melody for Computer Love for this song? And he got a one-word answer, which was yes. And that was it. So they're not particularly effusive as a band in communicating.
Not very stereotypically German.
That's right. Well, they're busy. They're working. They're working. Work will give them joy, or something like that. Pocket Calculator, big hit. Computer World, Numbers, and they were a firmly established, well-loved, known act now. I think a lot of people knew who they were. Album, new material tailed off a little bit. They got slower and slower, which eventually contributed to some of the members leaving. Electric Cafe was in 86, now known as Techno-pop is the name of the album. Much more digital by this time. They didn't need all that homemade stuff. A lot of sampling and sequencing. much more polished, much more dance oriented, but it does have the big hit Tour de France on it. They were big cycling fans in real life, loved to cycle every day, loved the Tour de France. But those of us who are in the Canon Film Club, of course, will recognize very clearly Tour de France's use in the film Breakin', or Breakdance as it was known in Europe, which we've covered on this channel in this little scene. So we can't play more of that, obviously, for copyright reasons, but featured heavily in Breakin', which was a big hit, and that scene is one of the best scenes. It's one of the best moments in any Canon film, using Tour de France for that. I know I mentioned you were here, Vigilante Williamson, but it is awfully good to see you, my friend. Great to see the great Vigilante Williamson here. So, Stephen Mack, yes, Ozone, the great Ozone. Yeah, Breakin's a great movie. Check out our stream we did on Breakin' and Breakin' 2. Great stream. The older Tour de France and the remake. So one of the things that Kraftwerk have been prone to do in recent years is remake and rework tracks with modern equipment. Occasionally it works. I prefer the originals. The Mix was one of these ones where they took the old stuff, rearranged it, used modern digital equipment. It's good, but I still like the originals. I think they may have introduced a couple of little new things in there, but really the last new work they did was the Tour de France Soundtracks 2003 album, which has some new material on it and expands that cycling theme that Ralph always wanted to do as a full-on thing. I think Florian may still have been with him then. He left possibly after this. Fully electronic. And then there was the Minimum Maximum live album, which was the tour I saw them in 2004. They did live stuff. Again, has different mixes then, slightly different sound. And then a 3D concert tour they did where they performed their catalogue. If you had the special 3D glasses, it was a very immersive thing. I haven't seen it, but... And there's other stuff, but a lot of remixing and so on going on. So, but that's a kind of a walk through the material. Huge legacy there, a lot of great stuff. But their influences, of course, were enormous. We mentioned Africa Bambaataa, West Coast and East Coast hip hop and DJ culture, which I freely admit I don't know much about. The whole techno scene. And it's the drum machines, the minimalist, repetitive rhythms, the four on the floor thing, which those genres of dance really, really loved. But then they had the Giorgio Moroder and that other electronic dance rhythm scene that was all hugely inspired by Kraftwerk. You can't underestimate their influence too much in that respect. The hip hop and dance stuff, best not to mention Africa Bambaataa. Yes, probably. I think there's some not so good stuff there, but it was the scene that was influenced. Another thing they influenced a lot was one of my favorite strands of things was Japanese electropop. Yellow Magic Orchestra, this album, particularly their first album, I absolutely adore it. Very heavily inspired by Kraftwerk, and I got a couple of little clips to do with that because I do like this. If you've never heard this album, it's got the great Firecracker and Space Invaders on it, brilliant track, amongst others. But they have a couple of videos. One is the great Richie Sakamoto of Yellow Magic Orchestra, who also did some of my favorite soundtracks of all time, as well as some great pop albums. He was asked on a show about dancing and meeting Kraftwerk and their dancing. So I'm going to share that video if you just give me a second. Here it is.
Kraftwerk came to Japan to perform first time in 1981, and three of us, YMO, went to see it, and we met, four of them, four still original members of Kraftwerk, and three from YMO, and we all went to a disco after the show. Florian and Ralph started dancing on the floor. Yes, like this kind of dancing.
German style.
Yeah, German style.
Yeah, now the reason I wanted to play that little clip after the Richie Sakamoto talking about their dancing skills was that example of they played. This is just from a couple of weeks ago, Kraftwerk in Japan, and they played that as a tribute to Richie Sakamoto. It's the wonderful theme from Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence movie with David Bowie in it, and that's the first time they'd ever played a song that isn't theirs on record or on stage. One and only time. I actually did a whole Rumble stream on Richie Sakamoto's passing, on his death. I did it on Rumble so I could play a lot of the music because I'm a big fan of his stuff. A lot of great soundtracks as well as albums, conventional albums. So, but they had a good connection with him. Devo, of course, we mentioned, very inspired, I think, by Kraftwerk, and Connie Plank produced their first album. Donna Summer, I Feel Love, that Giorgio Moroder disco sound. Get the 18-minute version. It'll certainly have you hypnotized by the end. Another Kraftwerk-inspired thing, Giorgio Moroder there is inspired by my look. He stole my look from me. Sparks, who many may remember the duo from number one song, This Town Ain't Big Enough for the Both of Us, American duo, reinvented themselves along with Connie Plank later as an electronic act with songs like Number One in Heaven, Beat the Clock. Very Kraftwerk inspired. Ron Mail already, or is it Russell? Ron already had the look for Kraftwerk in the middle now. So other stuff that we could consider to be inspired, apart from the Britpop stuff, which we're going to talk about a little later. Throbbing Gristle, Industrial Act. I love this. Throbbing Gristle, 20 jazz funk greats. Great album cover. I'm pretty sure that's not what you're getting on the record. But that industrial sound, it was an awful lot to Kraftwerk. Cabaret Voltaire. Joy Division, who I saw live once, and then their later New Order, of course, later spin-off New Order. Very Kraftwerk oriented. 9 Inch Nails could also themselves cited Kraftwerk as one of their influences for their sound. Sisters of Mercy, who Courtney was going to talk about if she was here. Another act that, especially with their constant use of a drum machine, they were very Kraftwerk oriented. And of course, Daft Punk. You cannot fail to see a link between Kraftwerk and Daft Punk.
Yeah, those are probably the ones I would know the most that are directly connected to them.
Yeah, definitely. Now, Rammstein. Obviously, we love them. Metal band extraordinaire. They themselves have cited Kraftwerk a few times as not only thematically but also with some of the repetitive rhythms and although they've laid a very different thing in it, are very influenced by Kraftwerk in many ways, I think.
I would certainly have, and I'm just hoping that's not where they got their penchant for fire from.
But I think, the fact that they're German also helps, of course. But, Ministry have also themselves cited Kraftwerk as a major influence, and God help us, Marilyn Manson even tried to nick some of the look.
We'll try not to hold that against them.
So that's, other than that, we're going to talk about some of the Britpop acts, though. I think the early Britpop stuff, electropop stuff, was hugely influenced by Kraftwerk directly. In fact, they even ended up competing with Kraftwerk. But before we get to that, I did want to play another couple of video clips that I've got. Kraftwerk were obviously a band that were ripe for parody in many ways. Well, we already had this, of course.
Now's the time man sprach für mich da!
But there's a British musical comedian who still operates to this day, very well known. He has done some stuff in America, a guy called Bill Bailey. I featured on the show before when he did the Sonic Spear Festival and he played Enter Sandman on car horns. He did the whole album, Bill Bailey and Metal, just things like Scarborough Fair as if it was done by Rammstein. He does a couple of very neat Kraftwerk spoofs. So I'm going to get away with playing a couple of those now. This is the first one. He plays that very obscure Kraftwerk track, the Hokey Cokey. And then he plays I've Got a Brand New Combine Harvester, which is by the Wurzels, a British comedy act, in the style of Kraftwerk.
Man steckt die linke Arm ein, die linke Arm aus. Ein, aus, man stellt das alles Man macht das Hokey-Cokey und man dreht sich herum. Das ist die ganze Sache. Man macht das Hokey-Cokey und man dreht sich herum. Das ist die ganze Sache. Ja.
So I just had to play that. I'm sorry. Bill Bailey is one of the funniest guys on the planet. And because he's a musician, he does all these different things, but he does do, so Argument, who we do have to check your stuff out. Bill Bailey did interview you about Kraftwerk. I'm going to look that up. I'm going to find that. Bill Bailey is brilliant. Yes, he was on the show Black Books as well, which is a very funny show. But he does some of the greatest musical comedy ever. Plus, he's just a funny guy, and he does various other shows where he's hilarious. But great musician as well, which makes all the difference. So, yeah, that is a bit more Pet Shop Boys, I know, but it's just the fact that you could do the Wurzels, I've Got a Brand New Combine Harvester in an electronic dance setting itself is funny. So let's talk before we hurtle towards the end of the show. Let's talk a little bit about. Let me just close that down. There we go. Some of the British groups that were directly inspired by Kraftwerk, and I'm quite fond of that era. I mean, I was a teenager in the late 70s, was doing DJ work, buying a lot of records, and there's this explosion of these post-punk, electronic-based new wave and pop bands. And it wasn't my main music, but I had a lot of this stuff, and some of these acts I'm very keen on. First thing I got to do is play a little montage I put together of these acts. Yeah, I would love to play more of that, but that's the most I could get away with with copyright. I had to keep chopping them down. Such a pain in the ass. A few of my all-time favorites in there. In fact, I'd say out of all that lot, Orchestral Maneuvers in the Dark are my favorite band out of that lot. Still to this day adore that band. But you had somebody mentioned that Human League Mark 1 there, not the Don't You Want Me Baby Human League, the Mark 1 Human League. Also, two Scottish singers in there. I'm sure the chat will know who they are. Two Scotsmans. Yeah, Electricity is killer track. I do love the fact they've got a live bass in it, of course, a real bass, but the rest of it, I love the whole thing. These bands really took what Kraftwerk had done and understood it and knew how to make great pop, electro, dance, or whatever they were doing. I would love to have done a longer montage there, but I had to keep chopping it off and cut some out completely. But yeah, two Scots singers in that lot. Anybody in the chat know who they are? Maybe they don't. I don't know. So let's have this. Yeah. So in there was, and we don't have images for all of them, were Ultravox with Vienna, which is extremely Kraftwerk, like very, very, very Kraftwerk. And one of the Scots was singing there, a little Scottish legend, Midge Ure, who ended up in Thin Lizzy for a while as a guitar player, but which we covered in the Thin Lizzy stream. He was singing on that. Great little Scotsman. But yeah, extremely Kraftwerk. Beautiful track, Vienna. Go look it up. Gary Newman, of course, with Tubeway Army, and then our friends Electric, and then Cars. We had Cars in there somewhere. New Order, Blue Monday, the successors to Joy Division, of course. The Joy Division Plus, you could say. Blue Monday, seminal dance electro track. Depeche Mode, I was keen on Depeche Mode in the earlier days. I didn't like it when they became this kind of big rock, pseudo-rock act, much like the earlier, funnier stuff. And then Vince, I think it was, left to go with Form Yazoo. Just can't get enough classic electro pop. Connie Plank indeed did produce Ultravox in Vienna. Human League, Empire State Human. Brilliant track. West End Girls, Pet Shop Boys, OMD, and Electricity. And some OMD, still some of the greatest songs made in that era, in my opinion. And The Art of Noise, I didn't feature in there for copyright reasons, but close to the edit, the Max Headroom stuff, and all that other great stuff they did, very inspired by Kraftwerk. Just actually watched a great. I forgot they did the soundtrack to the movie Dragnet, and they did Peter Gunn with Dwayne Eddy on the guitar, and the video was Rick Mail was in the video. If you watch it on YouTube, I'd forgotten Rick Mail did that video. It's a brilliant one. So look it up. Peter Gunn by The Art of Noise. And the Eurythmics were in there too. Of Annie Lennox, Scottish singer, of course. John Fox, who used to be in Ultravox, of course. So there are many, many other acts. That's just a few of them. I think even a flock of seagulls could be considered, and Connie Plank produced them too. So huge influence in that respect. So like it or loathe it, and some people may loathe it, Kraftwerk inspired all that stuff. Personally, I love it. Big fan of a lot of that stuff. So, and Trevor Horn, of course, was in The Art of Noise, and Trevor Horn went on to be major league producer as well as an artist who performed with the Buggles and Yes, even at one point, but major producer. So tons of stuff came out of this thing that was Kraftwerk. They're still going today with Ralph and some others, and I would go see them live again because it's a beautiful experience when they play their collected catalogue. I don't know if I've missed any metal bands that might have been influenced by them, even in look or style. But
as far as that goes, some people have in the metal scene have said they've been influenced by them. Whether I believe them or not remains to be seen. When Euronymous from Mayhem is saying that he was a big fan of Kraftwerk, you kind of cock an eyebrow and go, "Wait, what?"
Yeah, that's one of those like I don't buy that, bud.
But there's also a whole scene of ambient, a couple of different ones that came out in the metal scene. Like one of the guys who used to be an Emperor, Mortis, he's pretty much one of the progenitors of what's known as dungeon synth, which is music you can play an RPG to. Let's put it that way.
And James mentioned Fear Factory. I was going to bring them up. They're certainly probably the biggest American industrial act.
One of them.
Yeah, I mean, what would you consider? I mean, there's a lot of German acts that we love, rock acts, metal acts, Scorpions, Sabaton, Accept, so on. In fact, Scorpions did work with Connie Plank. I don't.
Sabaton's not German.
Yeah, they're Swedish.
I thought they were German. Sorry, they sing songs about Germany.
Oh, so does Marduk, but they're certainly not German.
You got me there. Sorry. I don't know. I misspoke. There goes my candidacy. I'm done. Yeah, and there's a lot of, as Davina's mentioning, KLF, Underworld, Orbital. The list goes on of influence bands. But the German bands, rock bands, other than Rammstein, probably don't owe too much to the Kraftwerk tradition, I don't think.
I don't know about that, only because you could say they tie a lot of their stuff back to KMFDM. And I would imagine those guys had some influence from Kraftwerk.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, they were, I think, in the 70s. I mean, we talked about some of the experimental German bands there, but they were the biggest known band I can think of in the 70s, biggest known German band, before the Scorpions became big.
Well, especially for Rammstein, I think that would have been an interesting pickup in the late 80s because they grew up in the East Zone.
Yeah.
So they would have been a whole revelation to somebody like Rammstein, who's grown up not being able to listen to all that music that came out in the last 30 years, or just starting to hear it here and there, and then you can buy their albums. It's like, holy shit, okay, we missed a lot.
Hey, D. Bud Martin, our great range, mentioning Alphaville, big in Japan. I just watched that video the other day. Big in Japan. It's another electronic thing. Somebody here was saying, oh yeah, but Papa Cotton says, I thought this was a show about movie catering. I don't know.
Well, that was a spin-off band, Craft Services.
Craft Services, yeah. Well, the meaning of Kraftwerk, yeah. I love this poster, Kraftwerk plus Disco at Sheffield University, 1976. I do love that. That's a great poster. This one's even weirder, and I think it might be, I don't know what country it's coming from, but something called Sergeant Pepper was on the next day. So, but yeah, they did have quite a touring career, although they were quite reclusive in general. But they did tour. So they weren't just living in the studio doing stuff. They did attempt to get out to the public and tour stuff. So got to give them credit for that. I do like this particular poster. This is for a gig at the Greek Theatre where they've got them with the Voyager gold disc images.
Yep.
It's a brilliant poster. Yeah, that was... This is the tour I saw them on, the Computer World Tour. That's the Hammersmith Odeon gig. But this is the weirdest one. It's a German open-air thing. Kraftwerk are on one day, but it's got that classic spelling error for the middle act. Brain Auger. Should be Brian Auger. So I just had to show that. Brain Auger, yes.
Brain Auger sounds rather unpleasant.
Well, it's three very different acts there. Family were kind of sort of, semi-prog, rootsy rock. Brian Auger's jazz, blues, and Kraftwerk are electronic. So this is kind of what they look like today. I don't think they go out in the street like that, but so you always get a great show behind them, which I have to say. Lots of great imagery. Autobahn, of course. Oh, and I forgot one more. Well, there's a poster. This is a neat poster too. There is one more act connected to them, which feature in the movie The Big Lebowski. So if you remember in The Big Lebowski, Peter Stormare and the Nihilists, they're actually a band called Autobahn.
Yeah, I knew that aesthetic looked familiar from somewhere. I couldn't remember where.
So it's a fantastic homage in The Big Lebowski by calling them Autobahn, and they're German nihilists. But it's I don't know if they actually ever made any music for that. But the nihilists, yeah. Oh yeah, Sprockets, which we mentioned, of course. Everyone should pet their monkey. It's only polite. Sprockets used as their theme a sped up version of Electric Cafe by Kraftwerk. They put a 33 version of it on and played it at 45. And that's what they used as their theme. So, anyway, we're almost at the end here. I actually found my program from that minimum maximum gig, including a little postcard that came with it. I'll make myself bigger, as they say.
Are you allowed to do that on camera?
You are. New single, Aerodynamique. The program is, as you would expect, pretty much just full of images. Not a lot of a blurb, just images from the shows. Numbers there. So a lot of those images you would have seen at the show, of course. Man Machine. There is one where it actually does mention their names. So actually some writing. But this time it was Ralph, Florian, Fritz, and Henning. So slightly the percussionists had changed by this time. The other guys, the first two that we talked about earlier, kind of got bored because it took a long time to make records for Kraftwerk. So they moved on. Anyway, thank you everybody for being here. I hope you've enjoyed this show. I'm so glad there was people in the chat that have direct and more detailed knowledge of Kraftwerk and the electronic scene than me. So thank you, Wellenstrom and Argument and others who've contributed those comments. I really appreciate it because as I say in all my shows, whether it be about music or movies, I'm not an expert. I'm just an appreciator. I like to talk about it, but I don't have the detailed knowledge. When it comes to metal, when we talk about it, that's why I've got Imp and Pope, because they have the detailed knowledge.
I don't know about all that in my case, but sure.
Vigilante, my friend, we will get you on a show soon. We'll have to have something that you want to talk about. We'll get you on. I'm sorry you weren't on today because you would have been great. My apologies for that. That would have been a good one, but we'll do it again sometime. We touched on so much stuff: Bowie, Brit electropop, industrial things that we can all talk about in the future. This was by no means a documentary, but I'm glad you enjoyed it, Vid. And thank you. Yeah, thanks everyone in the chat. Thank you to the mods, D-Bud Martin, our mod of mods, my high sticker membership level. Check out the memberships. Help support an old man who needs to eat and buy things. And yeah, but thanks to all the others who've joined today, the names we haven't seen. But thank you to all the regulars. You were all here too. Appreciate it very much. Love you all. Thank you for being here. Imp, what have you got to tell us about? Or have you any final words on electronic music?
Electronic music has its place. It's not exactly my cup of tea, as you well know. But it does have its place.
Yeah. Where is that place?
That depends on the person, I suppose. But some of it has influenced the stuff I listen to. Some of the more synth-laden black metal that I listen to, like Emperor or Limbonic Art, could definitely pull.
Emperor, yeah.
Stuff like that. Like I mentioned earlier, Mortis, Mortiis. It's all dungeon synth. And until his later stuff, there wasn't a vocal to be uttered. Like the CDs were literally 2 20-minute tracks.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting to know. I mean, I guess everything's electronic, as Davina's pointing out. I mean, guitars are really electronic when they're using electricity and electronics to process sound. Not truly acoustic, just keyboard-based stuff and other things like that took it a different way. You can be electronic and loud and heavy. I think.
Oh, yeah.
You can be. You can be super loud.
Rammstein's an example of that.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Pope, how about you? What's your feelings on the whole thing?
Well, I mean, I didn't know that much about Kraftwerk in the early years of that. I don't really dig down into the 80s or much past the mid-80s stuff when it comes to electronic music, but it's cool to see where it all kind of came from and how it evolved. Because I'm much more into the stuff I grew up with, like Daft Punk or a lot of stuff like that, like the stuff I know, or Rammstein, Fear Factory, Korn in some ways. So it's interesting to get a different look on that. Seeing it, obviously like Imperatives, I'm not exactly it's not exactly my particular brand of autism, but I do appreciate it for what it is, and like you said, it influenced a lot of guys we do listen to.
Yeah.
So it's cool to see where all that came from and the ideas that they were kind of siphoning off.
Sure. And I would urge anyone that's never listened to Kraftwerk closely, start with like Autobahn, Man Machine, Computer World. I don't think you'll be disappointed. I mean, you can listen to them all on YouTube for starters before you have to go buy them, but there's some really beautiful stuff on there and some really fun stuff. So thank you, Wellenstrom, for being here so late in Germany at 1 a.m. Thank you. Appreciate it very much. Yeah, unfortunately, we're in, I'm in Mountain Time in Canada, and these guys are in American time somewhere. So it's a bit late for Europe. I'm sorry about that, but thanks for being here. I've appreciated all the new people who've been in the chat today. Thanks. Anything you guys want to plug?
Just tomorrow we're doing something on Brahma's channel. I'm not sure what. I do believe it's Mad's birthday week, so we might be doing something.
It is Mad's birthday.
It's either this week or next week. I forgot which. So I think we might be doing something as far as that goes.
Yeah. Well, I'll be doing. I mean, I might be taking part in something if it's Mad's birthday tomorrow. Although I do Toxic Tuesday on Nick Visor's channel.
Yeah, like I said, I have no idea what's going on. I haven't seen anything posted in our group chat. So
arguments in the Isle of Wight in the UK, where they used to have these great festivals, which we've talked about a couple of times. Mountain Time doesn't really exist. But yeah, well, look out for you tomorrow then, mate. It might be on something with you. I'll never know.
And then Friday, the Ascended Art podcast.
For sure, where we'll have another pop quiz that nobody knows the answers to.
Chad's getting terrible about those.
Because they're terrible.
He's going to give me an aneurysm on stream one of these days. I guarantee it.
Well, I told him even the lyrics. I'm not good with lyrics because I'm old, and even the bands that I know and love, I still couldn't remember the
Let's
lyrics.
put it this way, Pope. This past week's music trivia was boy band lyrics.
And it was terrible. I didn't know.
And you
90
survived?
My eye was twitching.
Oh, yeah, there we go.
Yeah. So, Pope, how about you, mate?
Well, other than our usual midnight mass that I do every Saturday at 11 Eastern over on Rumble, me and our host here just did our final thoughts on the new album Invincible Shield by Judas Priest. So hopefully you guys will check that out. It was a really fun conversation. Really easy one to edit because I didn't have to do shit. But I basically just put my intro and outro out there and then posted it because we just did it all in one take. But it was a really good. I think it was a really good episode, and hopefully we'll have more of those coming soon on some interesting topics, ranging from probably midnight to a couple other things I've got percolating.
Yeah, I got to check that midnight stuff out you were talking about. So.
And eventually, at some point, we're going to get to, since Vellenstorm just brought him up, we're going to be doing a talk on Christian DeLorme's channel about Electric Light Orchestra. So hopefully you guys will join us for that.
Indeed, I provided a list of my favorite tracks to him, so
yep,
including some album tracks. I'm an enormous ELO fan, so
they're another one that's really unique and interesting, and very, very experimental, but I enjoy a lot.
Well, indeed, but thanks you guys for being here. Argument, I think you mentioned some of your music. I'm going to go try and find that, mate, and check it out. So I will look for that, and then hopefully we'll see you again and we can talk about that. Once again, thank you everyone for being here. It's been a fantastic chat as usual. You're all wonderful. Well, I love you all deeply supporting us, and I hope we all had fun. Tomorrow I may be doing something on the Mad Martigan side, but I'll certainly be, or should be, on Toxic Tuesday on 32 Flavors on Nick Visor's channel. We're doing another Western, but I can't for the life of me think of what it is because I keep forgetting. It's going to be a Western movie we're talking about. As for me, I don't know what we're doing next Monday, but I do have a couple of videos to work on. I got a couple of new Korean movies to talk about. I have a underlooked albums video I'm working on, which funnily enough is related to ELO. It's about a Jeff Lynne solo album that I love. So I'm working on that, and I'm looking forward to what the next future shows will be. And I got a couple of other short videos I'm hoping to do. So there might be a couple of new videos this week. So look forward to those. But until then, thanks again, everyone, for being here. Remember to stay well, keep on rocking, and we will see you all again very soon. Thank you for your support, everyone. Take care.